basic structure of the United Nations. Do you have any questions regarding the UN or how it works? Yes, sir.
Just a small thing. For any U.S. Security Council or other changes in the charter, presumably that has to pass the General Assembly.
Yes. Any changes to the Charter of the United Nations have to be passed by a 2/3 vote in the General Assembly. Okay, another question was regarding, when we're talking about international inequality, I suggested to you several principles that we could use in trying to reason our way through the question of whether this inequality was an unjust inequality or an inequality which was not, in some sense, unjust. And you will remember that some of the rules that I suggested to you for a just form of inequality should be an inequality where at the outset everybody had an equal chance to be a top dog or an underdog, to be a winner or a loser. We said that another condition for a just inequality should be that the rules of the game that produce the inequality should be rules of the game that were freely adhered to by all of the members of the community experiencing the inequality. And then the third principle, which I suggested was the principle proposed by a political philosopher who wrote a book called A Theory of Justice in the 1970s, and his last name is Rawls, spelled R-A-W-L-S. And this Theory of Justice is an immensely influential book in political theory and political philosophy. Some even claim that it is the most, it probably is, the most influential book in political philosophy written in the English language in the 20th century. Now, Rawls's approach to the question of just and unjust inequality is to say, supposing we could bring a group of people who are members of this community which will be experiencing inequality, supposing we could bring them together. And supposing, in this sort of mind game we are playing, that we could ask them, under what conditions would you consider inequality to be just? But with the following condition, with the following proviso. These people would have to know absolutely nothing about themselves. They could know nothing about their talents. They could know nothing about the kind of family in which they were born. They could know nothing about the talents that they have. They could know nothing about themselves that might bias the rules they would choose for determining when inequality was unjust. Because if they knew something about their own strengths, either strengths of birth or strength of geographical location or strength of talent or whatever, they might want to craft the rules of inequality in such a way that would determine that any inequality based on the strengths that they themselves have would be just inequality, right? I would do it, wouldn't you do it? So the idea is that you would have to assume what Rawls calls a veil of ignorance, where they know nothing about themselves. And then through a fairly sophisticated logical reasoning, Rawls is led to the conclusion that the rule that these people operating under veil of ignorance would adopt is that inequality was not unjust as long as any increase in that level of inequality correlated with an improvement in the absolute circumstances, the absolute condition of those who are at the bottom of the pile. In other words, if inequality increases, let's say the ratio of the top 20% 25% to the bottom 25% of the population increases from a ratio of 10 to 1 to 20 to 1. Inequality would have increased. But if, as a consequence of this increase in inequality, the absolute income of those who are at the bottom 25% increased, even though the gap increased at the same time, then that inequality would be one which those people operating under a veil of ignorance would accept as just. And here they are operating under what one might call an insurance principle. They know nothing about themselves, so they don't want any inequality to hurt them. So they want to make sure that if inequality increases, and they make the worst case assumption about themselves, that they're at the bottom of the pile, that their circumstances will nevertheless improve. So that's the Rawlsian principle, and as we applied the Rawlsian principle, as well as the other two principles which I had proposed to you, to international inequality, we found it hard, or at least I found it very hard to argue, that international inequality meets any of the conditions for a just inequality. But this is a very important principle, because in politics and in economics, when we talk about justice, most of the time we talk about justice as it applies to inequality. I mean, there are other things that might be just or unjust, or fair or unfair, but very often the big theme looming there is the theme of inequality. And it's important to have some basis for reasoning through the status of inequality. Nobody would agree that all inequality is always unjust. Nobody would agree that all inequality is never unjust. And therefore we need a rule for distinguishing between the two cases. And so far the most widely accepted rule that I know of is this Rawlsian rule, which is why it's a rule that is valuable to know. Would I say something about the law of comparative advantage and how it applies to international trade? Happy to do so. The basic rule behind comparative advantage is that nations should produce not that necessarily which they are best at producing, which means that they can produce the most of at the best price and at the lesser cost. Because even if a nation has multiple advantages in this regard, has, say, an absolute advantage in producing everything that can be produced, it would make neither it nor the rest of the world, nor other economic players, better off if it did so. What works to the greatest advantage is if every nation asks, what do I have a comparative advantage in producing? In other words, what do I produce best relative to other things? Not what I produce best relative to everybody else. And then if every nation were to focus on producing the things and only those things in which it had a comparative or relative advantage, and then acquired those things in which it did not have this relative advantage from those countries that do have such a relative advantage. If every country did so, then it can be proven logically, without a doubt, that the whole group of nations involved in this exchange would, as a group, be richer than they otherwise would have been. Would be richer in any case than they would have been only if those countries which had an absolute advantage in something produced it, or if everybody tried to produce everything. But this assumes, of course, that you can acquire from elsewhere those goods in which you do not, but somebody else does, have a comparative advantage. And so the ability to operate, to make the system fully, effectively operative, is to have an unfettered system of trade where goods can be exchanged so that you can always exchange those goods for which you do not have a comparative advantage. Now, one important thing to remember about comparative advantage is that it makes the collectivity of those participating in the trading system better off than that whole collectivity, if you took its aggregate income, would otherwise have been. It